Cisco Bradley, as many of you will already know, is a scholar of social, cultural, and intellectual history set in diasporan contexts, as well as a cultural theorist and historical ethnographer. Since 2011, his work has focused on music and migration, particularly as it has manifested in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. At Pratt, he teaches courses that tell the histories of people in motion: migrants, travelers, seafarers, merchants, musicians, and artists, pirates, pilgrims, fugitives, and refugees who've made homes outside of their points of origin. His talk today is entitled, "My Mind and My Spirit Were Liberated During the Riot, Solidarity and the Meaning of the 1967 Detroit Uprising," which is an excellent title. Please join me in welcoming Cisco Bradley. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. I love this course. I think I taught it some years ago, a couple of times, so it's always great to engage with students and have an opportunity to introduce students to what faculty are doing here. Before I start, I wanted to first of all thank a couple of people who have had a big impact on me, either doing this work generally or this specific research for this project. First, I'd like to thank Imam Mutawaf Shahid, who is the Imam in Cleveland. This book basically began with a phone conversation that he and I had back in, I think, December of 2020, when I reached out to him about work that he had done as a musician in the 60s, and we started conversing, and a lot of things kind of came out of that conversation, and he helped me connect with other people. So my incredible thanks to him. And this book is under consideration with a press, and I've decided to dedicate the book to Imam Mutawaf. So wanted to thank him for all his support and work with me through the years. A couple of other people I wanted to thank: Gabriel Van Lanningham Dunn, who's with us today, a writing colleague, an archivist, human, yes. We've worked together for years. Real comrade, I feel like, in the struggle to support music and culture and art and stuff happening in this city and in other places. So I wanted to thank you as well. Want to give special thanks to a former student of mine, Finn Horn, who was here a couple of years ago. He and I worked together right on this research project. I think he saved me about maybe 6 months of research time helping catalog letters written by John Sinclair, who we'll be talking about, the poet and activist and organizer, a bit today. John wrote an incredible number of letters, and I was unearthing them in the archive, and Finn helped me catalog them and summarize them and really accelerated the research. So I wanted to thank Finn for that. I don't know if he was a freshman or a sophomore here, but at the time, I felt like he was really doing graduate level research work with me. So to get into the topic, first of all, this is a quote from the saxophonist Farouk Zibeh, who went on to lead the band Griot Galaxy, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. In thinking about the role of the 1967 uprising in his own kind of development as a person, as a thinker, and as an artist. We're going to talk about a few different, I think, ways of thinking about this moment, the Detroit Uprising being the largest urban uprising in the history of the United States and the largest uprising since the Civil War. In the 60s, it was a volatile time, to say the least, and with the politics of the various state attempts to suppress the civil rights movement in various ways. So, and the responses. So, this project didn't start out with me thinking I was going to be studying the Detroit Uprising. It's gone in a lot, and went in a lot of directions that naturally it was there, but I was thinking, it started out with me thinking, I want to study the history of free jazz in looking at musicians who I think had been underwritten about to a degree, and had come out of these three industrial cities of Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. and some really magnificent musicians. Probably the most well-known is Albert Ayler, but there were many other figures. Charles Tyler, Charles Moore we'll talk about here, Frank Wright, Bobby Few, the piano player, Farouk Bey, Charles Gale from Buffalo, all major contributors to the music. And naturally, the project went in directions I couldn't have anticipated. Now, one of the things that leaped out of me as I was in the midst of doing the research that I couldn't anticipate in advance, really, was that when I studied this music in Cleveland and Buffalo, it was happening in almost entirely segregated situations, racially segregated situations. In Cleveland, I didn't interview a single white musician because there weren't any white musicians involved. In Detroit, what stood out kind of in my research experience was that there had been attempts at sort of racially integrating the scene, and more so along the lines of organizing around the scene. So, Detroit ends up being kind of what seemed like an exception to to the times. So I've been sort of thinking through that. The other thing that the research led me to really kind of engage with was the issue of the intersection between labor and race, class and race. As I began to think about the lives of the musicians that were involved in the 1960s free jazz movement, most of them were the sons and daughters of industrial workers. As I began to look further back in their families, I could often find several generations of them having been involved in unions, being involved in labor organizing, and some of that actually started in the South. In most cases, their parents had migrated from the South to the North and had come from, say, rural Western Alabama or the industrial cities of places like Birmingham, other places in the South. And so I began to kind of delve into the politics, of labor and race. And really the thing that I think I've been constantly kind of thinking about and grappling with was how effectively corporations manage to divide workers along the lines of race, to the mutual detriment of everybody involved, to prevent workers from really advocating for their own betterment. And it just, going all the way back to the Birmingham coal strikes in 1908, where the corporations did everything they possibly could do to pit people against one another. And so we see this kind of happen again and again. So I'm going to talk about labor and race. I'm going to talk about the emergence of attempts at cross-racial solidarity, many of which, if we look through this whole history, most of those attempts don't necessarily succeed. But I think it's interesting to look at it within the context of art organizing. We'll talk about the 1967 Uprising in Detroit, and then we're going to look at one example of an artist who emerged from that and became a major figure in Detroit. So, the first significant attempts to organize industrial labor in Detroit, and by the way, I'm going to be reading a bit because it's a book manuscript that I more or less have finished. It's being considered for publication. So I want to give you a sense of how I write. The first significant attempts to organize industrial labor in Detroit date to the 1880s, but took more serious steps forward with the formation of the International Workers of the World Union in 1912, and even more so with the socialist-led Auto Workers Union in the late 1910s. In the early years of the Great Migration, black workers joined the union movement, though their interests were inadequately represented. Still, many black workers faced racist attacks and violence from their white counterparts throughout the decades of early settlement in Detroit. And this goes for Cleveland and Buffalo and some of the other cities. Meanwhile, the Detroit police force expanded rapidly in the 1920s to specifically contain the growth of the black community and to suppress strikes. So we can see some real direct attempts at undermining the labor movement from the beginning. At that time, Michigan had the highest Ku Klux Klan membership of any state in the US, not Alabama, not Mississippi, not Indiana. With at least 32,000 members in Detroit alone, with significant representation in the police force. This set the groundwork for Detroit to have particularly violent and racist policing in the ensuing decades. Some measure of cross-racial solidarity was born out of common struggle as embodied in the United Auto Workers Union, beginning with the sit-down strikes of 1936 and 1937, sort of something of a turning point in the labor movement in the US. The National Negro Congress actively organized black workers, and together with the UAW, they successfully resisted Ford's attempts at breaking them along racial lines during the walkout of 1941. Due to demands for continuous production during World War II, some of the potent militancy of the unions was pacified, but the UAW used strikes to successfully secure significant wage increases in the years immediately after the war. Even in Detroit's so-called golden years following the war, say from 1945 to 1960, there were seeds of destabilization. The Red Scare in the 1950s set in motion processes to disassociate the working class from leftist politics. Anti-labor legislation such as the Taft-Hartley Act undermined collective bargaining power, and suburbanization introduced new racial dynamics that spatially separated workers along lines of race. Automation by the mid-1950s also began to erode the power of workers and their centrality to the process of production. These are all trends that continue up to the present. The National Negro Labor Council, led by future Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, demanded labor protections for women and workers of color in 1951, but met resistance from conservative elements within the UAW who conducted their own leftist purges. Automation within factories began to displace labor by 1952 and continued to be the specter of worker disenfranchisement. Black workers were commonly the last to be hired and the first to be fired within the factories and generally took on the most dangerous jobs, and their positions were the most vulnerable to redundancy due to automation. The east side of Detroit, where the community was centered, lost 10 factories involving 71,000 jobs between 1954 and 1960. Despite the general economic boom, the seeds of discontent were born. Detroit, like many other cities in the US, issued so-called urban renewal projects in the 1960s that decimated black cultural spaces. The Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods in Detroit, situated in the east and southeastern parts of the city, had been the vital heartbeat of jazz, blues, and R&B music in the city from the 1930s to the early 1960s, and had fostered several major poets, Robert Hayden, for example. Hastings Street, which had been the home to many jazz and blues clubs, was also targeted for destruction to make way for infrastructure to allow white suburbanites to commute into the city. In the early 1960s, under the guise of slum clearance initiatives and to make room for the construction of interstate highways 75 and 375, these areas, together with the dozens of clubs and concert halls that had been home to jazz and blues, were demolished. This undermined the jazz scene in the city in a way from which it has never really recovered. Many of the cultural developments in the city, and this goes for other cities, by the way, we can find the same trends in Columbus, Cleveland, elsewhere. Many of the cultural developments in the city in the following decade must therefore be understood as a reaction to this destruction, empowered by collective action and solidarity movements that solidified along lines of class and race in different configurations around the Artist Workshop, the Tribe Collective, and the work of Farouk Zibay and Griot Galaxy. The earliest free jazz scene in Detroit in the 1960s was the result of relative newcomers to the city who mostly came from neighboring parts of Michigan as well as from the South. Detroit was unique in that there were equal numbers of poets and musicians around the emergence of free jazz, but they worked together, wrote together, and often lived together in fellowship based on working class concepts of fraternity, mutual aid, and collective advancement. The community in which free jazz emerged in Detroit at the Artist Workshop was far more racially integrated than any other site in the US. The workshop was juxtaposed against a backdrop of racial tension, police brutality, communal violence, and mass-scale white flight to the suburbs. As segregated as Detroit was in the 1960s, it was still more integrated than Chicago, Los Angeles, Cleveland, Philadelphia, or New York. Detroit was somewhat unique, poet Bill Harris observed, in that a number of black people had good jobs, they had money. When the unions integrated, people came out of that like Coleman Young, who had power. Black people could get public sector jobs. At Ford, Chrysler, and other factories, we worked shoulder to shoulder with white people. The children of auto workers had time to study music. They could afford instruments and private lessons. People could afford to buy houses, but the city was still segregated to a degree. All right, here I'm a slide behind, I think. Okay, we'll go up here. Detroit lacked organic art spaces in the early 1960s to nurture the next generation. Several gallery spaces opened in 1963 and 1964 that became momentary centers for a new generation of aspiring artists, but soon the Detroit Artists Workshop would become the flashpoint of the city. It began with a meeting of poet John Sinclair on the right and trumpeter Charles Moore on the left in May 1964, and during their first encounter they stayed up all night listening to records and talking about free jazz. The next day, Moore moved into the house, where the Artists Workshop formed later that year, Sinclair explained. We were close friends, and race meant nothing to us, except for something that was oppressed by white people. How he explained it to me. Conversations between Moore and Sinclair that summer sparked the idea of creating their own performance space. John and Charles were the architects of the idea, photographer Lenny Sinclair observed. They became very close when they began talking about making things happen for avant-garde jazz in Detroit. On October 2nd, 1964, Sinclair wrote to Leroy Jones, who of course later became known as Amiri Baraka, a group of young artists of all persuasions here in Detroit have started to band together in a sort of makeshift community against the anti-art forces of the world. We are in the final stages now of getting a beautiful second-story loft as a center for our community. There is now a lot of activity going on here in Detroit that can be somewhat consolidated to the immediate benefit of everyone concerned. We're trying above all to create an atmosphere that will be stimulating and conducive to maximum artistic involvement here. The concrete workshop is really the first step. Now we'd like to establish communication with people who are really doing it in New York and let you know what's going on here. The workshop was to function as a community center, publishing center, and a place for artists not only to create and rehearse on a daily basis, but also to present their work. 16 artists were involved in the forging of the Artists Workshop, and they articulated their vision with a manifesto that expressed a clear sense of collectivism, anti-authoritarianism, and a decisive move away from the mainstream. It began with them defining what community was and why it was necessary for artists in particular, for fraternity, communication, and mutual advancement. In my paper, I do have a section of the manifesto. I don't think I'll read it all here today. It's a very utopian view in a lot of ways, where they're talking about trying to create a space for artists and trying to also push back against sort of the capitalist society in which they lived. Central to the manifesto was the refusal to see society as everyone competing against one another, and rather that there was a shared fraternity that they all held as the very definition of community. The idea of mutual responsibility and collective advancement bore heavy influence from labor organizing that had come to define the city. The manifesto targeted social alienation and isolation as distinct problems, and as the first obstacles that needed to be overcome if an arts community was to have any chance of doing something dynamic. Finally, the manifesto described how the community would function as a mostly non-commercial entity, welcoming to people regardless of financial background, bound together by an interest in a variety of the arts. As poet Robin Eichley, who was also involved, and Sinclair later stated, they were intent on, quote, working as independently as possible from the economic framework that the established order left us. We saw Detroit as essentially virgin ground. There was everything to be done. The raw material was at hand, and we started working to exploit the situation in the best interest of every artistically oriented individual in the community. The Artists Workshop is not simply for artists in the strictest sense, but is a community by artists designed to give any human being disenchanted or, more honestly, humiliated and disgusted by the present order of a means of first surviving in a dangerous world and then creating something meaningful from what is left. The artists involved in the collective rented a line of houses near Wayne State University, which became the Artists Workshop. Artists lived upstairs and the downstairs had seating and could accommodate an audience. At the time, it was something for white people to accept a black person as their leader. Charles Moore was our leader. That was radical then, Sinclair explained. He showed us how things were supposed to be, how to be himself, and how to do what he wanted artistically and in every other way. For those of us who were interested enough, he showed us some of the ways of how to go about getting there. He was supremely confident in his beliefs. He had no reservations, nothing could stop him. He never trembled in the face of opposition. My entire life is dependent on what I learned from him. And I did have the opportunity to interview John Sinclair quite extensively over a course of a couple of years, and I was very deeply impacted by his passing in April, and I really missed John. As the year progressed, the Sunday afternoon events attracted as many as 100 attendees each week, mostly from the student beatnik artist community that existed around Wayne State. As Bill Harris observed, the combination of the radical student newspaper, the workshop, the hippie movement, and the elements of the Black arts movement all at Wayne, these various groups began to commingle and find common ground. The most immediate and lasting impact of the Artist Workshop was the steady stream of publications that they issued over their 3-year existence, with collections of poetry and commentary and literature, poetry and music. And they were incredibly industrious in creating their own publishing systems. So I think if any artist who's thinking about how am I going to get my work out there, they got a mimeograph machine and they just started publishing stuff, and they started creating lists of subscribers, and they just started getting their work out there. And these were poets who were writers, musicians who were in their early 20s, trying to find a way to make it. And then they also created their own commentary. I think it's the most brilliant part of it, in a way. Like, they created what was the magazine that was called Change, where they were writing criticism of the art that interested them. So they also, in a way, became critics, though they hated the term critic. They really wanted to create a different kind of dialogue about the music and about poetry. They also always included multiple art forms in these sorts of publications. So, you'd have poets writing about music, musicians writing about poetry, and publishing poetry alongside music criticism within these publications. The Artist Workshop began offering classes for what they called the Free University of Detroit. Everyone who wanted to teach a class offered something in the arts, ranging across music theory, composition, music ensemble workshop, music and philosophy, jazz criticism, poetry, prose, theater, acting, drawing, painting, photography, and other areas of the arts. So they said, okay, we're not going to concern ourselves with kind of established education. We're actually going to just start teaching these classes to each other, teaching them to other people who are interested. One class engaged with anti-colonial movements through the writings of Frantz Fanon, Che Guevara, and Mao Zedong. And yet another course taught organizational methods of the New Left, and some provided space for discussion of sex and LSD. And this is 1964 and 65, and this was certainly before anything like that would be happening publicly. The collective goal was, quote, to offer an alternative or extension to the present university curricula and to build a permanent community of committed artists and scholars in the area. The Artist Workshop had revolutionary aspirations, as articulated in a utopian manifesto written by guitarist Ron English, who stated if they could form a separatist cooperative economy, spread literacy, increase access to birth control and sanitation, to enact non-destructive community redevelopment, break the power of landlords and reduce rents, establish nonprofit local manufacturers, and establish a baseline of well-being, then, quote, the revolutionary society may come about. Should the revolution succeed, it will usher in a golden age of arts and letters. It's quite utopian in a way, but also, I think, with an eye on the pragmatic steps to take. But then he added that such a thing would likely be short-lived due to the crushing response of the capitalist economy, slide slowly back into the status quo, or ultimately perish with the rest of society. To this, Eichley and Sinclair added, we at the Artist Workshop are not crazy enough to believe that this revolutionary society will happen tomorrow, if ever, but we do believe that it can be done. If enough of us are willing to start at the bottom, recognize the walls that our general society has put up for us, stop beating our heads against these walls, organize, and get to work. In late January 1965, the workshop drew up plans for their own jazz club. It was not a separate entity, but rather one to be incorporated into their ongoing operations. Their goals were clear: to provide a space for regular concerts by its 2 house bands, the Detroit Contemporary 5 and the Workshop Arts Quintet. They hoped also to cultivate connections with other aspiring free jazz bands, and they wanted to cement its presence by inviting figures from other parts of the country. So they're amazingly adept at networking. They're like, okay, we're doing what we're doing here in Detroit. We're going to reach out to people in Cleveland, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, on and on and on. And created this sort of network of people who were of like minds. From the very beginning of the Artist Workshop, the community faced challenges from the police. In 1964, John Sinclair had been charged with the sale of marijuana, but eventually pled guilty to the reduced charge of possession in December. For that, the state gave him 2 years of probation, though it's important to point out the maximum penalty at the time was life in prison. On August 16th, 1965, he was again arrested along with 2 others by an undercover police officer who posed as a marijuana buyer, and then carried out a raid with 24 other officers. Sinclair was constantly being harassed by police, Robin Eichley observed. He had his chin out, he was confrontational, he was not intimidated by them and let them know that. The strain of Sinclair's imprisonment was felt by everyone in the workshop since he had been the primary organizer of events. And the workshop basically kind of splintered apart during his period of incarceration. And in a way, that's what he became most famous for, as being a marijuana activist. Though he, brilliant artist, brilliant poet, and perhaps his greatest brilliance was organizing. And he was just, going through his letters, I would find that sometimes he was writing 5 or 6 letters a day to people around the country and around the world. So I want to show just a few images. I mean, here's Lenny Sinclair and John Sinclair. Lenny Sinclair was originally from East Germany, and she immigrated to the United States and attended Wayne State University. She's one of the great music photographers of that era. Most of, I think maybe all of the photographs that I have of Detroit at this time were all taken by her. A brilliant artist, and I had the pleasure of getting to know her and interviewing her as well. Here's the poet and playwright Bill, who has been incredibly kind, supportive of the book project, and almost to the point of mentoring. I felt like I learned so much from him, and he was actively involved in the artist workshop during the years of its operation, from '64 to '67. And he taught for many years at Wayne State later on. Here's a picture of the Detroit Contemporary 5, led by Charles Moore, who's at the center. On the right, there's Ron English on guitar, Larry Nozero, I believe, on saxophone, and John Dana on bass, and Danny Spencer on drums. I think everyone there is, Michigan born, except for Charles Moore, who was from Alabama. He came north to attend university. Here's John Dana and Ron English, again, 2 of the musicians deeply involved. And interviewed Ron quite considerably. Unfortunately, quite a number of the musicians involved have passed. This is Andrew Hill. I mean, he's not associated so much with the workshop, but he did perform there, and he was quite responsive to their efforts to get, they wanted to bring in artists from other parts of the country to kind of build up the scene that they were a part of. Brilliant piano player, born in Chicago, played in New York for many years. You can't go wrong with the Andrew Hill record, I think. Joseph Jarman, the great saxophone player from Chicago, came out of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. He was, of all the Chicago musicians, and Detroit and Chicago had a really strong connection in the '60s with artist exchanges and connections. He actually moved there and supported, I think he even lived at the workshop for some years, for some months in 1966 when Sinclair was in jail. He was deeply involved, and brilliant saxophone player. If you're looking for a record that'll blow your mind, go and listen to Song 4. And there's many other great records by him, but that's probably the one that I stick with. And here's another photo of Charles Moore. I'm running a little behind schedule here, so I was thinking of playing a piece here by Charles Moore that was released not too many years ago, but you can certainly find it on YouTube. I think I'll save the time here to continue on. This is Charles Moore and John Sinclair here with their motorcycles. Oops. I think I didn't. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Now I want to, we're trying to talk about sort of arts organizing before the '67 uprising, where we do see these attempts at cross-racial solidarity, attempts at mutual kind of building, and after. The early phases of the deindustrialization of Detroit laid the groundwork for new resistance movements in the 1960s. Between 1947 and 1967, Metropolitan Detroit lost 47% of its blue-collar manufacturing jobs as new employment opportunities rapidly moved to the suburbs. Young black adult residents were particularly hard hit, with at least a quarter of them unemployed, with occasional spikes in joblessness reaching as high as 76%. The city has never fully recovered from this deterioration, as capital was carried by the same currents that resulted in white flight to the suburbs. Between 1950 and 1960, the city's black population increased by 180,000, while its white population decreased by 350,000. These changes coincided with company executives making aggressive moves to destabilize workers' ability to organize effectively for living wages, benefits, and middle-class livelihoods. The institutionalization of power relations between the UAW and the corporations also caused the union to lose touch with significant portions of its its membership, especially black workers, by the 1960s, as the latter began to increase their demands. There was a proliferation of black nationalist groups in Detroit through the 1960s in various forms, including the Nation of Islam, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Panthers, and the Republic of New Africa. And the city became the epicenter for many of these groups. In my other research, I interviewed one of the co-founders of the Revolutionary Action Movement in Cleveland, Don Freeman, a really amazing figure. Attempts at cross-racial solidarity also continued in Detroit within the labor movement. And I think I may just because I think I am a little shy on time, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. But there were, I think the unions and some of the black labor organizers were really focused on maintaining links, across these lines. And I think one of the reasons why I think Detroit was a little bit unique at this time in the U.S. Every person I interviewed who grew up in Detroit in the 1940s to the 1960s referred to the police as a white supremacist organization that brutalized the black community. Black neighborhoods faced extra-legal harassment, beatings, and killings meted out by rank-and-file police officers. Just in the years 1958 to 1961, so not even anywhere close to the peak of the clash that came later, 12 black residents of Detroit were killed by police with impunity. The police were also connected to the FBI's COINTELPRO program that aimed at undermining and attacking black power groups. Police brutality only increased through the 1960s. Poet and playwright Bill Harris characterized the situation as, quote, "The police were still a constant problem with us. They were basically like hit squads." By the early 1970s, racist policing in Detroit enacted a program called Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets, which employed decoys to entrap and murder black men. Over the course of the 3 years of the program, 22 men were killed by police without any repercussions. The election of Coleman Young, the first African-American mayor of Detroit in 1974, would eventually, according to one of the musicians I interviewed, quote, "make the streets safe from police." So now let's talk about the 67 Uprising a little bit. And none of the histories that I've read about the 67 Uprising have they really taken into account some of the perspectives of the people who were initially involved and taken them seriously. I've seen all kinds of different histories written. Usually, you're going to hear about the cost of the destruction to the city, which was immense, $40 to $45 million of damage. But to think about why the uprising began in the first place. Early in the morning of Sunday, July 23rd, 1967, undercover police officers made arrests at a local social club at 9125 12th Street, a street that was later named Rosa Parks Boulevard, and that had formerly been the site of the United Community League for Civic Action, an organization aimed at mobilizing black political support in local elections. After the group had become defunct, it continued as a social club, or what they called the Blind Pig, which sold alcohol and permitted gambling without city-issued licenses, though this was a pretty common practice. There were quite a few blind pigs. And actually, if you lived in New York before like 1990, you would, that kind of stuff was happening all over the city here too. The club bred a feeling of commitment to the community, of brotherhood, according to William Walter Scott III, the son of one of the founders who had worked as a bouncer at the club. He wrote, "I developed a feeling toward my people. I began to care about what happened to them, as well as to myself. I think this made the whole difference in my life, because people have got to care about each other if they are going to live together without hurting themselves. And for the most part, this is all they knew. When people hurt and don't have any way to stop it, the only people they're around is each other, and then they're going to direct their anger at whoever and whatever is present or nearby at the time. Usually the wrong people. Never the cop or the white and the Negro store owners who cheated us out of every cent we had. No, not them, the keepers of the poor. The club was a refuge from the depredations and atrocities of everyday life, as Scott explained. People were frustrated, they were tired of police, tired of fightings and killings. It just got to their heads. It was just too much, so they danced in the club. He added, the dim atmosphere, loud music, talking and dancing made the club a family gathering each time we congregated. The whole affair was a brotherhood composed of people who cared about happiness and the sharing of their mirth. Everyone was dancing, laughing, having a nitty-gritty, funky good time. The club was trembling with the clapping of hands and the stomping of feet in rhythmic syncopation to the intoxicating music of Mr. James Brown. In the darkness before dawn on July 23rd, resistance to police presence outside of the club on 12th Street quickly erupted. William Walter Scott III had been arrested in a previous raid during which he had been beaten by police. Recalling the earlier incident, he wrote, I wanted to fight back and hold my stand. The cop was wrong for hitting me. So in those early hours of July 23rd, when he approached the club and saw police arresting his father and sister, he found a bottle in the street and he threw it, thinking, quote, I didn't care right then if they killed me. Inside the club, the police had smashed the jukebox and wine bottles and had done considerable damage to the club itself, all without a warrant. Scott reflected, I felt powerful and good inside for being a part of those who finally fought back regardless of fear, and admired the, quote, unification of the rebellious spirit of man, a fearless spirit ordained by complete liberation of the self, combined with and supported by a community at large. Guess one could say it was like fighting and gaining your citizenship after having given it away to the obedience of the law, police law, which was a one-man judge and assassin that ruled black people. Scott's initial act of resistance was quickly joined by a chorus. So his throwing the bottle was the first act in the uprising. From the early morning hours into the bright light of day, thousands of people joined what exploded into a mass uprising in Detroit. Despite attempts by police, firefighters, city officials, and some black community leaders to stem the tide, the movement grew. From its epicenter, the revolt spread into the neighboring streets, and by the evening had moved downtown in the form of arson, looting, and destruction of businesses and residences. The Michigan National Guard, state troopers, and 2 U.S. Army airborne divisions outfitted with tanks were called in, and a curfew was instituted to quell the uprising that was noted for having no organized leadership, but was rather a wide-scale and spontaneous insurrection with considerable popular support. Pitched battles and sniper fire between residents and the authorities spread north into the Dexter-Linwood neighborhood, east towards the north end, and further into the midwestern parts of the city, reaching an apex by Tuesday and Wednesday, and finally dissipating by the beginning of the following week. So it lasted for just over a week. Approximately 40% of the 7,200 people arrested during the uprising were employees at the city's auto plants. And though it was black-led, many working-class white workers, themselves Southern migrants, also took part in what one scholar has called a working-class rebellion. 43 people were killed, 33 of whom were black, and at least 29 were slain by state forces. The Detroit Uprising was the largest rebellion in the U.S. since the Civil War. The poet and percussionist Sadiq Mohammed Bey, who I also interviewed, who was an eyewitness to the events and a participant, stated plainly that the prevailing mentality of the uprising was, quote, take what you can get. Scott added, it was a free day for everybody to do and be what he wanted, regardless of the world and its laws. The rioters and looters did have one common interest, lack of respect for the law that had abused them and their right to live. Pianist David Dura, who later recorded with Detroit's Tribe record label in the 1970s, was in Detroit during the uprising and nearly lost his life during the events that unfolded. At one point, he was standing by a window looking at the helicopters that were patrolling overhead when a National Guardsman shouted from the street, if you move, I will kill you, while another Guardsman told him to open the door to the building. Eventually, Dura opened the door and the officers stormed the building, physically assaulted him, and held him with a bayonet at his neck while they unsuccessfully searched for guns. They arrested his friend who was doing yoga on the roof, and Dura claims that they attempted to plant a gun on him so that they could arrest him as well, all the while keeping an M16 rifle pointed at him. I'm glad that my wife wasn't there at the time, because that would have made them kill me. She's a German Jew. If they had found me with a white woman, they probably would have shot me right there, Dura stated. His friend witnessed the officer trying to plant the weapon on him and convinced the commanding officer to intervene, which may well have saved his life. From the fires of the Detroit Uprising, and we can look at a few of these images. I tried to be selective in the ones that I brought. I sort of explicitly tried not to bring any that were showing violence enacted towards the black residents of Detroit at the time, since we get sort of inundated with these kinds of images all the time. As you can see, the effects were pretty intense. So, let's get to the final part of this. From the fires of the Detroit Uprising, there emerged one of the city's most profound artists, saxophonist and music theorist, Prof. Bey. Music had been stirring inside him for some years, and as I talk about him, I sort of thinking he's perhaps one of the great examples of the artistic renaissance that a lot of people talk about in Detroit post-1967. In 1966 and 1967, two pivotal events formed a turning point that compelled him to embrace the avant-garde for the rest of his life. He's talking about free jazz here, or his own sort of understanding of that. The first was hearing the John Coltrane Quintet with Pharoah Sanders play at the Jerome Lounge in Detroit during their residency there in June of 1966, so about a year before Coltrane passed. It impacted me to the core, Bey reflected many years later. I had never heard any music that deep or profound before. It shook me to my root. My entire, attitude about music changed. Bey was born Jesse Davis and grew up in the Conant Gardens neighborhood on the northeast side of Detroit, a highly educated community that traced its roots all the way back to the milieu that surrounded the Detroit Anti-Slavery Society that had been founded there in 1837. His father was an auto plant floor worker and then later a city bus driver. He studied mathematics and existentialism at Wayne State Community College. After spending a brief period in the U.S. Air Force, he became a disciple of the Moorish Science Temple, changing his name to Farouk Zinji Bey. He later converted to Islam and became an active figure in Detroit's Muslim community. I was approaching music entirely from one angle until I heard Train play at the Drome. It affected me intellectually and spiritually, Bey explained. That's when I realized that the real expression of what has come to be called music is a total unifying force, unifying energy that brings every aspect of your existence and being into play. I saw that clearly when I saw Train and Pharoah. He added, when I first heard Train, I knew that was what I wanted to do. Bey regarded Malcolm X to have shaped his political vision and Coltrane to have focused his spiritual yearning. The other major spark for Bey was the Detroit Uprising itself. The night before it broke out, Bey and his friends had gathered for a celebration of the life of John Coltrane, who had passed away just 5 days earlier. They stayed up all night. In that moment, the music gripped Bey and he realized he needed to play saxophone and pursue the course with his life. Detroit had all kinds of oppression and repression entrenched in it, Bey stated. The uprising was a reaction to that, the police violence, the unhealthy political attitude of the city. It was inevitable. My mind and my spirit were liberated during the riot. Bey further observed, the people who were rioting in the street, they moved like one mind. It was almost like how a hive of insects moves. These are his words. It was like a wave, it just moved. But that whole episode put me in a frame of mind of thinking about our position here as a subculture and how to deal with that. And since music was always an interest of mine, and seeing how our music defined itself in our relationship to the greater environment as well. Frequent early collaborator Sadiq Mohammed Bey noted, it was post-riot Detroit, it was all wide open. We were brand new people. Whatever we wanted to be, we could be. We were making jewelry, making art, performing. It was a renaissance. Everyone was a renaissance man. It was toward locking is a step toward killing the form itself. killing the form itself because it's no longer spiritually alive. The crystallization of a form to me represents the form at its least effective, because at that point the form itself has ceased to grow and change. It has ceased to be affected by other forces around it. So consequently, it's locked in. It's dead. Life is motion. Death is stasis. In terms of being translated into working metaphors for living people, living forces, that is no longer useful except as a reference. In my estimation, since I'm alive and caught up in the thraldom of living, I'm only interested in those things that are alive. I will take time out to observe crystallized forms as reference, but I can't spend my life studying death. I felt very strongly about it. Then turning to his own approach, Bass stated, I see what is called improvisation as the process of making living music. I only see that as a metaphor, and the more you can stretch that metaphor, the more meanings you can give it in a positive way. I see that in any piece of music I write. I try to make it a microcosmic equation for the macrocosmic equation that I'm living in. I try to have it reflect my own existence in terms of my environment. So all of the forces in my environment are brought to bear on it. Consequently, in terms of the classical approach to composing music, I have to break a lot of laws, because that approach to make music does not apply to the times that I'm living in. So consequently, my music is constantly changing, and I hope that it continues until I die. And that shows me that it's still alive and capable of responding to the environment itself as I live in it. Bay was very much in dialogue with thought contemporary to the Black Arts movement in the early 1970s, such as the ideas that were gathered together in the landmark book, The Black Aesthetic. Farouk Zibay formed the band Griot Galaxy, referencing the West African keepers of history, law, literature, and tradition known as griots. One of the key figures who joined the group was bassist Jaribu Shahid. And also, I should give a shout out to Jaribu, another great supporter of the research I've done in this book. Shahid's introduction to jazz was through John Coltrane's record Ascension, and he had gained experience playing around Detroit. Shahid was also coming of age with organizations like the Republic of New Africa and the Pan-African Congress. The music was inseparable from the politics and other culture of the time. I approached music in the same way, as rebellion, Shahid stated. Like Sun Ra said, that within every people there are a few who are responsible for maintaining their ethnic structure. So I thought that was something we had to do. Every generation has to do that. Jazz had changed throughout its history with influences from everything happening around it, and at that time we were pushing it further ahead. Another early figure in the band, Alrita Dodds, who was both classically trained and influenced by gospel, met Bay and soon joined the band. I felt like we were all equals, she stated. It wasn't until years later that I realized how unusual it was to have two female instrumentalists in the band at that time, and that was due to Farouk's leadership. The group, of course, played music during their rehearsals, but band members recalled that some sessions were entirely devoted to philosophical discussions, and that sometimes there were listening sessions that covered everything from Andean panpipes to Balinese chanting. At the core of the group's concept was polyrhythms and unusual meters, though it was commonly bassline and melody driven. Bay liked to employ a variety of scales, modes, and as scholar Kofi Natambu has argued, what distinguished Bay's individual contribution to the recent tradition was an equally committed and creative appropriation and extension of ancient traditional modes, expressive forms and structures culled from North and West African sources, as well as Middle Eastern ideas and modes from Arabic and Islamic traditions. Bay saw himself connecting his present existence in Detroit with ancient Africa, Egypt, and Mesopotamia through a kind of rhythmic consonance. As Bay noted himself, he became aware of direct connections to West Africa at an early age. Quote, when I was 13, my great-grandmother told me for the first time that on her side of the family we were Bantu people, Bay said. I wanted to find out more about those people. Both of her parents were Bantu, and she was born in slavery. But the library claimed that there were no such books, no such things about African history. Through the years, he had studied the history privately, which contributed to his own consciousness. There were an awful lot of Muslim brothers over in Africa stolen illegally. Once you know the real story of things, you have a better idea of who you are. Our music was about rebellion, but it was also about extending Black music forms. Jaribu Shahid explained. Regardless of what we were doing with time, there was still groove. As former bandmate Sadiq Mohammed Bey, who I mentioned already a few times, wrote of the band in 1980, Griot Galaxy is a group of musician composers that have survived the insurrection and pacification of contemporary music in the last decade. Their force at times is something to contend with. Their style is not reminiscent of any one composer, although an influence of several modern contributors is heard in their music. The power to incite the emotions to outright pleasure, pain, and indifference has erupted in the scientific writing of Farouk and Griot Galaxy. Griot Galaxy established itself as one of the most rhythmically complex and interesting bands of the 1980s. Bey wrote most of their pieces, though Shahid, Tani Tabal, the percussionist, and occasionally Anthony Holland, saxophone player, also composed music for the group. Many pieces that they developed were never recorded. The band members also began donning silver face paint and branded themselves as a new wave science fiction band, which Bey explained as a quote, a response to a modern environment speaking about androids and robots and that sort of thing. It was a particular brand of Afro-futuristic performativity rooted in the Motor City, which owed so much of its supposed glory to technological innovation and advance. Our thing was very visual, earthy. It was all coming out of Detroit. Saxophonist David McMurray, who also played with the group, stated, not David Murray, but David McMurray, two different people, both saxophone players. Even for people who didn't really understand our music, the visuals clued them in. Okay, sorry, I'm a few slides behind. I do this. So anyway, there's a photo of John Coltrane playing at the Drome that we mentioned earlier. There's a beautiful photo of Farouk Bey taken by Lenny Sinclair. Even in his personal attire, Bey shifted from African-style garb in the 1970s to biker's leather in the following decade. At other times, the band was described as, quote, polytonal space funk. And I'll play a little something for you later, and we'll see what that means. Former bandmate, okay, so Sadiq Mohammed Bey wrote of their performativity in 1980. Before their performance, one notices galvanized garbage cans, buckets, assorted saxophones, and percussion instruments scattered about the stage. But the silver-painted faces that appear behind the instruments set the environmental mood for exploring human emotion. The listener is immediately grabbed up into the arms of Griot Galaxy and sped off into other worlds of innovation. Some call it jazz, some call it avant-garde, some even ambiguously call it new wave, space music. Bey added his own perspective. I call it the logical extension of urban folk music. While I'm not particularly carried away by designations, the term urban folk music closely approximates what we're trying to do and has even more profound implications for the future. In further explaining their stage theatrics, Bey stated, in the old sense, ritual is a form of sympathetic magic. In that sense, the ritual is to remind the people of the analog nature of the world that we live in. Like the Hindus say, all is Maya, or illusion. And we have to remember that. Everything is an illusion. And by remembering that and being conscious of that, then the illusion falls under our manipulation. It falls under our sway. We thereby gain a certain amount of control over the nature and the direction of the illusion. So we can use that analog to describe certain things. There will always be ritual in human existence because ritual is the symbolic analog to an activity that's going on another level. The reality has all these different layers from the microcosm to the macrocosm. And these analogs hold throughout that whole structure, that whole hierarchy. This process relating one level of concreteness to one level of metaphor until you arrive at the core of truth, which seems to be what Bey was aiming for. Bey commonly rooted his understanding of music in mathematics. In fact, he often saw no separation between the two. Old cultures never differentiated between music and mathematics, he stated. What Griot Galaxy is trying to accomplish is a recognition of spiritual technology as well as physical. Bey considered improvisation to be a paradox in that, quote, in order to improvise properly, one must bear in mind the original theme, as well as whatever new data one is trying to bring to the form. It's impulsive, it is predicated by one's total experience. Intuition is the facility that synthesizes a priori knowledge with the unknown. Improvising for Bey was a spiritual experience. see if this is, there are a couple of their album titles, their album covers, rather. As Griot Galaxy emerged to some critical recognition and seemed on the verge of wider success, Bay wrote that he experienced, quote, a rough period for me socially and artistically and in every other way. There was just a lot of confusion. On September 28, 1984, while under the influence of alcohol, Bay endured a near fatal motorcycle accident that left him in a coma for over 2 weeks, and from which he never fully recovered physically. Bay's recovery was to be arduous as the left side of his body was paralyzed in the accident. He would eventually regain movement through years of physical therapy. He also eventually worked to overcome alcoholism. It constituted something of a new spiritual awakening, as he stated. I came away with another knowledge, another knowing about this condition that we call life. Now I want to end by playing, it's a live recording, so the sound quality is not perfect, but I thought a band that was so performative and so visually interesting, I thought we should see a live performance. So let's just close by watching this if we can. We got it following? introduce some music, since seeing as the theme is songs for the dark. So I do want to take time for questions. And I know I tried to cover a lot with this talk. Probably tried to fit in too much, going from labor organizing to avant-garde jazz, but that's what we did. So.
Amazing. First of all, thank you, Cisco. That was fantastic. Yeah. So I'm going to try to go back and forth between the virtual world and the real world here in terms of questions. So I have this one Zoom question, but I want to prioritize real world first. So would you like to go first?
I'll spark it off. That's fine. First and foremost, thank you very much. There's a lot of the shit I did not know whatsoever. So anytime you can school me, that means that school is.
You're someone who knows.
I know everything. I didn't know half of this shit. So, in your research, two-part question. In your research, what role did Detroit-based record labels kind of play in the formation of scenes like microcultures, but also archives? Motown leaves Detroit in '72. So you still have 5 years of Motown being in the region, but you have the rise of the early rise of the Motown jazz label, the Jazz Workshop. You also have Tribe, as you've mentioned, and you even mentioned something in regards to the importance of dancing in social spaces, which led to eventually the invention of techno. In Detroit,
created multiple genres. Right?
Multiple genres, and in Detroit is still, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, probably the largest hub for independent black record labels in the U.S. right now, including Theo Parrish's Sound Signature, which is probably one of the best labels on the planet, in my opinion. But how did labels, play into that? Also, how did major figures in the jazz world who were from Detroit, Yusef Lateef and maybe even Donald Byrd, play into some of these conversations at all?
Cool, amazing question. Thank you so much. Funny. It's a very appropriate question because in the book that in this book manuscript, I have 3 chapters on Detroit, and the one that I skipped was on the Tribe label. A lot to talk about there. I think it should be noted first of all that John Von Battle starting I think his record store and label in 1947. I think it was for one of the first black-owned labels in the country, if not the first. It's certainly a major moment. I think from World War II on, there was certainly a lot of that happening. I think I was telling Dan before we started, in a sort of horrible irony of the '67 uprising, one of the tragic, some tragedies there, but John Von Battle's store got burned down. He was actually out defending it, he had a sign that said Soul Brother on it, and he was standing in front of the store, and eventually the police came through and said, "You can't be out here." So he left, and then I think his store later got burned down, and he wasn't able to recover from that. There's sort of things like that. Motown leaving in '72 was huge because the Motown label, they employed so many people, just so many session musicians. Right. And you talk to all the jazz figures of the '60s. They were making their money as session musicians working in the Motown studios, and then they were doing the music. I guess they probably wanted to do maybe more in terms of the creative side, playing jazz in the clubs and these other spaces. Motown leaving in '72 was obviously a huge hit, and in a way, Tribe was started as a response, with people saying, okay, well, we're not getting that Motown money anymore, basically, and not only that, but we want to start a label that is creating music that we want to do, so we're not going to just be doing sessions, we're going to be out there really, pushing our own work forward. Tribe was an amazingly well-run label for the time that it existed. It was only a few years.
Only a few
But-
years. And
But they put out a,
publication as well.
and then they had a magazine. Once again, creating your own commentary, your own criticism, like all of these things. I think, you know, if you're an artist trying to get, you know, or a creative person trying to get yourself out there, I mean, I think building the narrative is key. And I think, you know, I mean, some of that can be done on social media nowadays, but I think it should go beyond that. So, I mean, there's a lot more. Strata East is another, or Strata, I guess, not Strata East, but Strata.
Yeah.
Strata was another one. So I mean, I think, you know, those homegrown labels that, you know, they were visible to an extent, right? I mean, Strata, I thought, you know, they put out a lot of great stuff. I think they survived longer than Tribe. But you know, both of those labels were obviously huge. So yeah, and you know, Tribe, I interviewed both Phil Ranelin and Wendell Harrison, and Wendell, I think, ran it out of his basement or something, you know. So and did amazing work for that label. So yeah, I mean, you know, talk about like creating your own press, creating your own, you know, labels, creating your own whatever magazines. I still think that stuff's all still possible today, you know. And if you're an artist thinking along those lines, you know, I think it's worthwhile. I could say a lot more, but I don't. In terms of other jazz figures in Detroit, I mean, the use of Latif should be mentioned in any discussion of Detroit. Donald Byrd, there's a lot of, I mean, Detroit in the 50s, people called it the second city of jazz and all of that, second to New York, but whatever. I mean, Detroit had a major scene and a lot of really key figures coming out of Detroit. So I'll still say it now. I got a backlash on Facebook when I think it was 2 years ago I posted Detroit has one of the most interesting music scenes in the U.S. right now. I still stand by that. I think, I mean, there are amazing jazz innovators. Last time I was there, I went to an underground hip hop show in a warehouse. It was incredible. I mean, it's the kind of thing that probably happened in Williamsburg 20 years ago, but can't happen in New York anymore. So, I think Detroit, you know, it still has space. It has amazing artists, people who are really trying to innovate. And like you said, Detroit's responsible for, I don't know, certainly Motown and techno, and you know, it has contributed R&B and soul and all sorts of stuff, jazz. So yeah, I mean, Detroit's such a huge, one of those cities that I think it just like has had such a massive cultural impact. And sometimes I think people don't realize. Yeah, amazing how many people I talk to don't know that techno came from, like, it sort of started in Detroit, or you know, so. Okay, I want to take some other questions.
Okay, good. So let me let's switch to Zoom land for 1 sec. And Carl, if you want to try to, we'll see if Cisco can hear you from my computer. Otherwise, I'll just try to relay it.
We'll give it a shot, Cisco. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, you're good.
Fabulous. I wanted to frame my question in the fact that this is part of the Crit Viz program. To have you talk about two things. One is your research method and how you felt an ethical approach towards your subjects, many of whom were in their late 70s or later when you started talking with them. How were you able to piece together the story of the 67 Uprising through their voices and archival work? And the second one is talk as much as you want about the production, the writing, the crafting of this narrative. As this is a book within a larger series, and within that I also have a question for you that I've not brought up. Have you thought of doing an article specifically about the 67 Uprising as a hook for the book for scholarly audience?
Thanks, Carl. Those are all great ideas. I mean, the research process, I try to pair in-depth empirical, archival research with talking to participants, eyewitnesses, people who were there. It's interesting. I mean, I was trained as a historian. We've kind of known sometimes to go off into archives and not really talk to a living person. And about 11 years ago, I began interviewing artists, kind of more almost as a music writer, interviewing a lot of artists in New York. And it's just become part of what I do now. I can't really imagine writing a book where you don't have the ever-present human voices in there. I mean, there's obviously I mean, there are a number of key people who I was never able to interview. I was never able to talk to Farouk Bey. I was never able to talk to Charles Moore. And I wish I had. I tried to talk to, I mean, I interviewed Charles Moore's sister and his widow. So, I mean, you try to talk to people who knew them. John Sinclair, I got to know. I really valued those times. I interviewed every person I could find who had been involved in the artist workshop who was still alive. Unfortunately, I think John Dana had passed, but I did talk to Ron English. I mean, if we can have a real conversation. I've talked with people I didn't think maybe would talk to me. I mean, let's be real about the racial dynamics of the work. I didn't know that. I didn't know if, like, say, the great Don Freeman would talk to me. He was targeted by COINTELPRO. He was one of the first major black leaders in the country to be targeted. They had him publicly fired from his teaching job. I mean, he's been through a lot. So, I mean, I approached him. He just said, "Just come over." So we sat down and had a conversation, like two, grown, adults. That's what we did, and it was great. It was beautiful. I learned a lot from that. I always think of Don Freeman saying, that the jazz was the single greatest influence on why he became a revolutionary. He talked about, he said, when I went to his house, he had two photos on his walls. They're otherwise very undecorated. One was of his late wife, the other one's of John Coltrane. So, I mean, there's things you can learn about people who, like if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't have known any of that. We sat, we've kept in touch. I think of, the first time I spoke with Imam Mutaf Shahid. I think he's with us still here in this session. I imagine I think we've even maybe joked about it. I think at first he was probably, who is this guy and what's he doing, So you have to build trust. You have to build trust and show that you're real and that you're trying to do something real. Just to be completely, straightforward, I interviewed a lot of people who either, who identify as black nationalists, sometimes, identify as black nationalists now. Sitting having real conversations about the violence that exists in this country. And if you can look at it together and think about it and talk about it, I think that's something, and it's a I think we need to have more conversations around these things. So I don't know. So that's research. I also, there's just things that you stumble on. Like I stumbled on 700 letters written by John Sinclair between 1964 and 1967 at the University of Michigan archive. I didn't know those were there. And I found, there's a John Sinclair archive. I thought maybe there's going to be a one, folder of things or something. I went there, I spent 4 days. I had to go home and I had to come back and for a second trip and spend another 4 days in that archive. So that, sometimes you just get lucky, and I felt like that was luck. Musicians don't keep letters, I think, generally, I've found. John was a writer, so he kept literally every single thing he ever wrote. Research, writing, it was an intense time. I was doing this during COVID. So, many of the interviews initially that I conducted with people were done on the phone. People were available because it was COVID and nobody was, nobody was had any social events, or, musicians weren't working, and it was a tough time for people, but people were available. So I reached out, I didn't have a grant or anything like that to do this research. I should say I had a small grant that I used from Pratt that I used to do some of the archive visits. But sometimes people would ask me to pay them for an interview. I would pay. I couldn't pay a ton because it was just, it's like paying out of my pocket, but I tried to respect people that way. It just depends on how you want to go about trying to build trust with people. Writing, I guess, I saw this as part of a bigger project. I wanted to do a project that looks at free jazz in different parts of the country and also incorporates the migration that preceded it. I don't quite know how to understand any of 20th century American urban culture at all without trying to engage with the migration that created those cities. I mean, every city in the US was massively transformed between 1910 and 1950 by the Great Migration. So the migration has been sort of ever present. It's been the hardest part for me to sell to a publisher because they just want me to talk about the cities, not talk about the migrations that happened before. So I'm hoping my current publisher, or the ones that are considering it, will go along with it. But you know, I think I've had to think through that a lot. There are 2 other books in what I was thinking would maybe be a series. I don't know if I'll do them all or whatever, but that was my original view, thinking of sort of the East Coast, and then thinking about the movements out of Texas and the Mississippi Delta, where people went to Chicago, St. Louis, and LA. So, and then looking at the developments of music in those settings. So I don't know if I'll get to all of it, but that was my original sort of view. And I think, I mean, the 67 Uprising, I mean, the parts that I read here, I mean, first of all, you want to be careful, I think, I mean, I don't think anything here would be incriminating. I mean, if this was closer to the time, I probably would change people's names in how I wrote about it. You know, many of the people that I'm quoting have passed, so I felt like I could use those quotes, you know, pretty explicitly. I always try to talk to people about how they want to be represented. So, you know, if you're talking to somebody, you know, and say like someone like Don Freeman, I mean, he said, well, just say, you can use anything I say. So, but I did want to make sure I would never, I don't know, say anything that could be used against somebody in a legal way. I don't remember if there were other parts of that question. So, Carl, if you can remind me, or maybe I've answered.
That was basically it, but this could be a great article, 67 Uprising alone, depending if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, well, there have been a couple of books that have come out in the past 10 years about the 67 Uprising. There are bits and pieces of them that are interesting, but I feel like there's one that tried to somehow take a so-called balanced approach, and it fumbled just magnificently in a way, or horribly, I guess is really the word. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. Some people just didn't want to talk about it. I think I think some people found it to be traumatic. I mean, and it was for a lot of people. So, and you can go to Detroit now and still see a little bit of the signs of it. So, alongside the marks, all the signs of deindustrialization. So, but I think there's still a lot to be, we should be having these public conversations about stuff.
Just a very brief comment. I wrote down one thing you collected. I didn't catch where it's from, but from the 12th Street event.
Yeah.
Which would be a great title for a future project for you, I think. And the quote is, a nitty-gritty, funky good time.
Yeah. I have to say, one of the gold mines in the research was finding the book written by William Walter Scott III. It's called Hurt Baby Hurt. And it just documents his involvement in the uprising. He published it in 1970, and I'm a little surprised that he did, but because he talks about very explicitly about what he did, what he saw, who else was involved. I don't know. But I liked how I felt like he brought us right into that moment. I really haven't read anything else, not much else about I mean, I have, but I felt like he brought us right to kind of into the events and made us feel like we were standing there kind of watching over his shoulder as to what was going on. And talking about the importance of that particular space. I think like we can look at the macrocosm of the Detroit Uprising, but to think like it started in one particular place where people felt like their community space had been violated and these weren't going to take it. And sometimes it just takes someone throwing a bottle and so everyone else is like on board with it. It was basically my read on that kind of the events that unfolded. I mean, we don't often have, detailed, long written things about people involved in these situations. And it was hard to find a copy of that book, but I did eventually track it down. But I recommend it. Honestly, it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read.
It's getting republished really soon.
Oh man.
I'm not doing it, it's not me.
No, but
I looked it up and it's like, oh yeah, it's like pre-order right now.
Oh, no kidding.
On
Interesting.
the website, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think when I was looking a couple of years ago, Amazon was selling one copy for like $1,200 or something horrible.
I think it was a small independent black press, I think, at first.
The original, I think, was it
Yeah.
Third World Press or
Yeah,
something like that.
Ghetto Press or something like that, yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
That's right. Any other questions?
Okay, we got time for one or two
Love to
more.
hear from students too.
Yes.
Got 3 questions from non-students.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, from what I can tell, before 1967, it seems like there was like a renaissance in itself in Detroit.
Always Renaissance happening in Detroit.
Right? So I guess I'm curious about how the after effects of the uprising or the uprising in itself actually allowed for people to become freer in expression. Like what actually like changed in Detroit because of the uprising that let this happen?
That's a great question. I think some of it, I don't know. I mean, I guess what I've sort of surmised is that people felt like they had, to a degree, had claimed that space. So they felt like people felt like they could really kind of operate how they wanted to operate. There's also, I think, simultaneously a lot of, I think, in this case, sort of Afrocentric cultural movements happening, right? So, I mean, this happened in 67, by 68, 69, 70, you just have a lot more, I think, people generally in the US who were connected to what was happening in Africa, the independence movements that was happening simultaneously. And you have and this is 67, it's just what, 8 months, 8 months later, whatever, Martin Luther King is assassinated, Bobby Kennedy's assassinated a couple months after that. And so, I think, it's probably it's not just the 67 uprising, but there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of changes. And I think people, like I said, the Afrocentric cultural movements, I mean, with people adopting clothing, jewelry, music, musical instruments, all kinds of things, from Africa, from West Africa maybe in particular, and kind of incorporating that. And I think that was fuel for I think change. You have people converting, and that's personally transformative. So I mean, people converting around 70, 71, I think was kind of a bigger conversion. Farouk Bey was part of that in Detroit. So, and that stuff was, that was also happening in Cleveland, other places, Buffalo. I mean, most major, cities in the U.S. had Black Muslim movements happening, conversions and stuff. So, so I think there's a lot of things contributing all at once, but I think it also opened up the space a bit. I mean, there was also more. I mean, if there was already white flight happening, it accelerated after 67. So, I think, say parts of Detroit became, more Black controlled than they had been before. So I think that played a role. People felt like they were maybe to a degree more in control of their communities. And then Coleman Young was elected. So that was, I think that was an important, certainly a turning point for Detroit, to have a former labor organizer, someone who had been really invested in the community, kind of, propelled into office. So I don't know if that answers it, but it's like, I feel like there's a lot of things kind of coming together at once. I think, the feeling of getting a big weight off of people, off of their shoulders, feeling like they'd thrown off, a lot of the stuff that they were dealing with. Obviously, the struggle continued. What other questions do people have? I'd love to answer
I
a
have a
few.
question.
Yes.
I'm curious about the Black Muslim movement
Yeah.
and the conversion that you just talked about between 1970 and 71, and if that had if like that religiosity had an effect on the music and the art.
There've been some books written about that. Definitely, because I think, along multiple lines, I think people were becoming more international in their view, than just in their kind of vantage point. Like, not just looking like what's happening here, but they're looking like, oh, so, connecting, I think, transnationally, internationally with other things happening. So I think that, that's, I think, a big, I think, the personal transformations of going through a conversion, I think just naturally, people have, I think, faced a profound truth in their lives. So I do think that's significant, thinking about how people became artists or how their art changed. I should also mention, I mentioned Imam Mutawaf Shahid, also of Cleveland, Imam Hassan Shahid of Birmingham. They were both involved in the music in the 60s. And after they converted and became, basically became leaders within the Muslim communities, they took on other roles. They weren't necessarily playing music anymore, but they were, taking on leadership roles. So I think it actually it can go like in several different directions. It's interesting. I think like we talk about this close connection between, like, say, jazz musicians and Christian preachers. I think there's also this connection between sort of, Muslim leaders and coming out of creative movements like this. So, I don't want to say more because they should really speak for themselves. I think, in terms of thinking about, kind of taking up the mantle of leadership in the communities. Other questions, thoughts? Denounce everything I say, whatever you want to do. Responses, questions, feelings. We can talk about feelings.
I have a question, but I want to see if anybody else does first. Yeah, okay. So, if you don't mind, this was so rich, and there's so much going on here that was really generative. But I wanted to come back to the beginning of your talk, where you were talking about the workshop and like their argument that kind of like the most fundamental problem to be faced was one of like social alienation and isolation. And it felt to me like that was kind of like a theme throughout a lot of your talk, just the importance of kind of like developing those connections, both in your own research, but also in the organizing work of Sinclair, right? And so I guess I was kind of just like thinking a little bit about like, if you took any lessons about that period into like the way that you're thinking about, existing in the world today, what might those be?
Well, I do think the same problems exist.
Yeah.
In fact, I think they're probably worse maybe now than there were before. I think we've been, and not to sound like some sort of like old fuddy-duddy who can't handle social media, but like I think we've been conned into the idea that it's social, that it's going to build bridges, and it's really about personal projection for the most part. Think of like Instagram. You're putting something out there, people either like it or they don't like it. There's a little bit of discussion. We're now communicating through machines, which I don't think helps. I think face-to-face communication, and I don't think that can ever be fully replaced. Now, internet and social media has its place. I think you can forge connections that way. But it's sort of like that the thing I found most intriguing about the workshop is that they talk about sort of like, the problem is that we're convinced that we're all competing against each other. So we have to get past that. And they actually, in other parts of the paper, I talk about how someone saw the destruction of the ego as being like an important part of that. And I wasn't sure whether I should include this, but the way that when I talked to Sinclair, he said LSD. He said, they doing psychedelics in the 60s had a transformative impact. I'm just kind of relaying what he said. And he said, it made us realize that like, A, we're not in competition. B, we should be finding ways to cooperate. C, we don't need to play the game. So the strongest, I mean, I took it out of the paper, but it's in the book. I mean, John Sinclair said to me, he said, I asked him this silly question of what did Ellis, like, how did LSD like have an effect on you? And he said to me, he said, to me, it made me realize that everything that I was looking around at was fake, and that I didn't have to work a traditional job. I didn't have to do like, he said basically, we had to find a way to kind of get past the egos. Otherwise, it's just me competing against you, and we're all vying for resources. But if you get past that somehow to some sense of collectivity, I'm not advocating for drug use, whatever. I'm just like, that's just, I think, was something that people were doing then. And he talked a lot about it as a transformative process. So anyway, I don't know. I mean, I think some of that though comes out of the unions. I mean, a lot of people said that to me. Our parents were like working in the auto plants, and there was some kind of sense of I think mutual responsibility, collective bargaining, collective advancement. It doesn't mean it was utopian or perfect by any means. But I think I still get that sense when I'm in Detroit today. There's some kind of sense, I think, of collectivity that I find very appealing and interesting about the place, that I don't find. Certainly don't find it in like hyper-capitalist New York, where we're all trying to make it, we're all trying to survive, we're all kind of dealing with the landlords. The other thing that I thought it was interesting how they talk about, like, we don't think the revolution is going to be easy, but we think it is possible, and we're going to try to make an attempt at it. So, yeah, there's a lot. I don't know. I'm not advocating everyone go out and riot by any means. I'm certainly not saying that. What I'm saying though is I think if we're going to draw some conclusions from this is that envisioning some other future world is important, even if it's unattainable, or that maybe it'll take a long time to get there, or that it's going to take a big change to get there. I mean, the thing that I'm always struck by when I talk to people in the 60s who were involved in radical politics, who were involved in arts, is they weren't setting their sights here, they were setting their sights all the way up there, even if they thought, probably won't get there. And there's something, I think, invigorating and energizing and kind of motivating in that, that we're going to set our sights high and we're going to try to get there. It's better than aiming low and just getting low. It's a real, like people talk about total revolution, talk about completely transforming things, changing the economic system, changing the social structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry, by the way, my audio's gonna play a little bit out
I have to say, talking with...
For some reason, when I take my headphone off, it plays
I mean, it's also, I have to say, on a personal note, it's been interesting talking with people who are my parents' generation. Really, I've been interviewing my parents' generation. My parents are now, my dad's 80, my mom's 78. Same generation. And I think it's helped me understand them a little bit, But, I mean, I think, how do we change things? I think most people today are terribly dissatisfied with how life is being lived. But we also are somehow simultaneously convinced that it's the only way. Oh, no, we're never going to change that, so why bother trying? Well, I mean, if you want to play to lose, that's a great philosophy.
All right, I think that's a really good spot for us to end on. Thank you again so much, Cisco, for coming and sharing this story.